Okay, we're going to start the next topic on exercising muscle. This video will be covering muscular adaptations to exercise, and then I'll post a second video in terms of neuromuscular adaptations to exercise. So we'll begin with muscle hypertrophy. And hypertrophy, if you don't know the term, you could always Google it, but it pretty much stands for increases in size. And here we're talking about increases in muscle size, muscle diameter, muscle circumference, any way you want to look at it. We can do that two different ways. Either by increasing contractile hypertrophy or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and we'll talk about both of these in detail. In terms of contractile hypertrophy, that's talking about increases in contractile proteins. When we think back to our anatomy courses, or looking at the sliding filament theory for that matter, or any of those kind of physiology classes you might have had, what's really important for us for contracting the muscle is more sarcomeres, more actin and myosin, more proteins that will cause contraction. So what we would like to do in terms of hypertrophy is increase those contractile proteins, increase that actin and myosin, increase those sarcomeres. And we can do that in two different ways. Well, yeah, we can do that in two different ways. One's in series and the other is in parallel. One is much more common than the other, and we'll discuss both of those here in the next slide. But in series hypertrophy is not significantly contribute to muscular hypertrophy because, as you'll see in a second, it doesn't really increase diameter. It's more of an increase in length, which as we grow occurs, but as I'll explain in a second when I show you the image. It's not very common in adulthood in types of training that most of us do. But if we add the sarcomeres in parallel or next to each other, we could then increase contractile proteins altogether, and you'll see the increase in circumference diameter, and those will help us increase force production and lift more resistance. In terms of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, that's mostly non-contractile elements such as glycogen, collagen, fluid buildup, byproduct, more blood flow, all the mitochondria, all the types of things that might increase within the muscle due to exercise that does not cause contraction. Now, you might hear it called non-functional hypertrophy, but that's kind of a misnomer. It doesn't really necessarily mean it does nothing for you. It just isn't functional in terms of helping you increase the force production out of that muscle. It can potentially help you recover faster, potentially increase in diameter, have more energy or fuel sources there within the working muscle, so you can maybe last longer within your sets or reps. So there is some function to it, but in terms of lifting more resistance, it doesn't really help too much. But it does increase your hydration of the cell, which can increase overall size. It's like filling up a water balloon. If you put more water in that water balloon, the water balloon gets bigger. It's kind of the same thing within the muscle. So here we have two different types of hypertrophy, and here at the top we have what's called contractile hypertrophy in parallel. So here, if we increase let's call these sarcomeres, 1, 2, 3, and here we can have our actin and myosin and where we actually do our contractions. If we add left and right to these, you would see inside this muscle fiber, and we increase the myofilaments within it, it would have to expand. Left and right, it would increase its diameter if we put one here, and if we put one here, I could probably do a little bit better job with, let's see if I can get a pen out here. Here we go. If we put one here and here and here, this belly would have to come out to help, contain all that. So if we could keep adding contractile proteins like actin and myosin in parallel, we would then force the muscle belly or the muscle fiber to increase in diameter. That's usually what we're trying to do in terms of muscle hypertrophy. Let me get back to the laser pointer. I know there's a way to erase all this stuff. Let's see if I could erase it. Erase pen, there it is. I'm not used to using that. Here, if this is our original muscle fiber and we added, again, contractile proteins in parallel, this is our hypertrophy. Here would be in series. So we had our 3, 1, 2, 3, and we increased contractile proteins in series. So in front or in back, top or bottom, if you want to look at it that way. This will increase the length. As you see, if this is the original length here, from here to here, and here the length hasn't changed, it just got wider. This actually increased in length, which usually occurs in growth as we're getting, as we're going from a child to an older adult, and our muscles essentially have to increase in length as we get taller. This is going to occur. It's rare in training programs that this might occur. Usually if you see this, it's usually in animal studies, and they have done some kind of crazy contraption, like just like stretching wings of a bird or hanging rats by their legs or something bizarre. It's really uncommon in the fully grown adult that this will occur in basic training programs. If it is to occur, it's going to go through long stretching style exercises, very heavy loaded eccentrics or something of that nature. Maybe you would see it there, but it's very uncommon. Here on the bottom left, you have hyperplasia. Hyperplasia you might read about, and I've seen some people recently talking about how humans could have hyperplasia. I don't even know if there is really any human studies to show what hyperplasia is. And what hyperplasia is these are muscle fibers, and inside the fibers we have our myofilaments and our actin and myosin. What we're talking about in hypertrophy is we're adding more myofilaments or more actin and myosin. Here we're talking about adding more muscle fibers themselves. So this is very rare. Usually, just like fat cells within the body, we are genetically predisposed to have a specific number of muscle fibers. Now, there's the potential due to injury, traumatic event, that a fiber can split apart from each other. And there's times through training that it might look like we add another muscle fiber from damage, and then we rebuild, remodel a fiber right next to a damaged fiber. And that could occur. The issue you have within hyperplasia is that it's really hard to study. It's really hard to test. So if you were to take a muscle biopsy of the quadricep, and first off, you're only going to take a very, very small segment of that quadricep. So it's really hard to tell how many exact number of muscle fibers you have there. So usually you can only count fibers within cadavers, and counting fibers in cadavers has to be probably the most tedious task if anybody's even actually done it, because you could have tens of thousands of fibers within a muscle. So first off, if you have a cadaver, you'll never know if an exercise program increased hyperplasia, so then you have to do it in a human. And how are you going to actually, ultrasound doesn't really give you enough of an image to view the entire muscle. So it's really hard to actually count all the fibers and then recount after a training protocol to say, yeah, we now increased the actual number of fibers. So anybody that claims that they can increase your muscular size through hyperplasia, I'd be quite skeptical of. Usually what we're looking at here in terms of training program is hypertrophy in parallel. And when we do have hypertrophy in parallel, we tend to increase our force production. We don't really increase our velocity or shortening capacity, but when we have really long muscles, those in turn aren't very good at increasing force, but they're really good at increasing speed. They can shorten really quickly, and they have a high velocity. So here's two images, both myofibril and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Here, myofibril, you'll see these are exact same circumferences, these two or these three fibers. If you circle these and circle these, they're the same exact size. But you see there's a lot more myofilaments, all these little black dots, within the muscle fiber, where here we have much less. So this type of fiber on the left is contractile hypertrophy or myofibril hypertrophy, synonymous terms, that we would have more actin and myosin here, which means that these muscle fibers would have a better chance at increasing force production compared to the fibers on the right. Here they're the exact same diameter, so from the outside these people look exactly the same size. But this could be due to increases in glycogen stores, fluid buildup, collagen, extracellular byproduct, stuff of that nature. That could increase the diameter. So some people might call this useless. Again, I think that's not the best term for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I think it has a different use. It's just not as useful in terms of the actual contraction or force production. So how we actually can increase our muscle size. First, you need to have what's on the right here. You need to have increased muscle protein synthesis in comparison to your muscle protein breakdown. So when you go to do an exercise, and it could be resistance training, it could be cardiovascular exercise, it depends on what it is, you're still going to have some kind of muscle protein breakdown. And when we talk about proteins, we're not talking about your food sources of chicken, steak, stuff like that, fish. We're talking about contractile proteins. Those actual myofibers, the actual muscle fibers, the actual actin and myosin can actually be broken down. We need to cause that. That's actually a good thing in terms of training. But we need to make sure that we have greater protein synthesis or rebuilding, remodeling of those fibers to increase our muscle growth. So when you're actually at the gym, you're causing damage to your body and little micro tears or increased stress to that muscle, and that's a positive. You want to do that. But the most important thing for muscle growth is what you do outside the gym, and that is proper rest, proper sleep, proper nutrition, because that's when the body's going to repair itself and go through protein synthesis. And that's when you actually will see changes in muscle size and strength, for that matter, is through recovery. So the bottom bullet there, muscle growth doesn't happen while you are actually causing the damage. You're actually breaking yourself down. It doesn't happen when you actually lift the weights or you're at the gym. Growth actually happens when you let your body recover from it and repair the damage you've caused. So how do we actually increase the muscle cells? Well, one of the major hypotheses on how this occurs is through satellite cell activation. They're very similar to how a stem cell would work within the body. And and I'll show you images of these in a second, when you activate satellite cells, these satellite cells have a nuclei, and they can fuse together with other satellite cells to remodel. Excuse me for a second, I gotta sneeze. Remodel, maybe not, and help repair that muscle. So they contribute directly to the growth of new myofibrils. Now, what the last bullet is in terms of genetic freaks or hard gainers, what those are really saying is the difference between someone that is a genetic freak or someone that is really capable of getting really big or really strong, someone that, genetically was predisposed to being able to increase hypertrophy a lot easier than someone else. So we have people that are genetic freaks in terms of how skinny, how lean, how strong, how fast, how explosive. That would be someone that's a genetic freak. In terms of the word hard gainer, that's someone that really struggles to increase in size or lose body or improve body composition, lose body fat. Someone that struggles to see changes. And there is some research to show that's the difference between these two categories of people. Someone that responds quickly and someone that doesn't respond at all can be due to the amount of satellite cell activation. So here in this image, we might have a myofiber. We have our muscle fiber, and within this muscle fiber, you have your nuclei, and we have satellite cells on the outside. We have 5 satellite cells around the outside. If you look at the image on the right here, you'll see that. Let me see if I could. No, it doesn't work here. We have all these little blue dots, and we'll call those blue dots nuclei, and here we have our muscle fibers. So you may see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 9 fibers and a handful of nuclei around there. And we'll call those satellite cells to make it easier. But as you train, you might cause some damage to that fiber, what's called proliferation, breaking that fiber up or damaging that fiber. What's going to happen is the satellite cells are going to send a signal out, like a satellite sending a signal. Say, hey, we have some damage here. We need to repair. They're kind of like a 911 call center in terms of calling for help in all ways possible. Like, we need a cleanup crew. We need a repair crew. We need all that kind of stuff. And these satellite cells will help do that. And they will not just call for help for macrophages and other things, which we'll talk about in a second, but they also will themselves fuse together and start to create and rebuild new muscle fiber or myofilament or contractile proteins, for that matter. So here we see a damaged fiber here on the right, and look at all these blue dots. This could be satellite cells with nuclei coming to aid in the repair and remodeling of this muscle. This is very similar. Same kind of thing happens when you get a cold or you have an infection. you have the body repairs in a similar fashion. So here we see, look at all these new myofilaments and all these bigger nuclei here, that we have these fused together satellite cells that can help repair and remodel, and they've now started to create their own myofilaments. So in an image in a muscle here, where we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, now we have much more than that, maybe 12, 13, 14 new myofilaments or muscle fibers. Well, let's call it myofibrils, or however you want to call it. This way we now have more contractile proteins. Next time we train that working muscle that we damage, we'll be able to prepare itself for future exercise. So this is what I was talking about. This would be in terms, the hard gainers would be the non-responders, and these might be your genetic freaks. So if you put a group of males through a resistance training program, let's say, it can be males or females, and let's call it a 16-week, we'll say they work their leg extensions 3 times a week. So they sit down on a machine and extend their quadriceps against resistance, and we're going to do that for 16 weeks and increase the resistance to make things more difficult, and see if we can increase the diameter or the size of their quadriceps. You might see after 16 weeks that some people didn't see any change in growth, no muscle hypertrophy. And that same exact workout program, you might see people that increase their muscle hypertrophy by 58% drastically. What we can see through, maybe it's a muscle biopsy of that quadricep muscle, is that prior to exercise, we had very little satellite cell in the area, and then after that exercise, we saw no change in satellite cell activation. It could have had a little bit, could have had a lot. They could be there, they could just lay dormant, they could not be called upon, or they might not be there at all. Moderate responders, they might see some activity with their satellite cells, and then the people that really shown the greatest amount of growth, those satellite cells were very active. So that could be one of the hypotheses on why, or a way of increasing muscle hypertrophy through resistance training. So the question becomes then, how do you activate these satellite cells? Like, how do you turn them on? How do you get them going? And there's really 3 ways. There's maybe a couple others, but in terms of hypertrophy, what we're talking about here is mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. What we're really saying with these 3 terms here are, these are 3 things we can cause through a resistance training program that disrupts homeostasis within the body. That's really the major goal within resistance training, is to cause progressive overload, so the body is always forced to adapt, always disrupting homeostasis, and then always having to either respond to that situation and grow, or potentially you overtrain and you break down and you have to force yourself to recover from that. So each one of these are slightly different. We'll talk about each one of these, but each one of these factors mediates various processes that ultimately act on muscle building pathways to increase that protein synthesis or decrease that breakdown of that muscle fiber. So we'll talk about each one of these. Muscle tension is quite simple. It's the amount of tension developed by a muscle fiber in response to a stimulus. So usually when we cause tension, we're thinking of elongating that muscle or stretching that muscle under resistance or under load. Most of the time we do that through a dynamic movement or chronic stretch. Sometimes you might do that statically. But mechanically induced tension, which is us with a resistance like a dumbbell or a barbell, going through a stretch is essential for muscle growth. Also will increase range of motion. So one thing we need to make sure we do that is continually add a heavier resistance through full range of motion exercises, because if we go through the full range of motion, we'll go through full eccentric contractions. If we go through that full eccentric contraction, we'll have the greatest stretch possible. So again, eccentric is that lowering phase of an exercise. So it's like if I'm lowering my body in a squat, if I'm lowering the bar down in some kind of pressing movement, lowering the bar down in a curl. As I lower that weight, I'm going through an eccentric. As I'm going through the eccentric, I'm increasing muscle tension. So not just that eccentric by itself is an increase in tension, but if I add resistance and continually add resistance every time I go work out, I will continually increase muscle tension. And that is one of the major ways that we increasing the muscle tension will cause damage to the muscle. And if we break up that, disturb that integrity of the muscle, we will then turn on these myogenic pathways. That one of the major ones is mTOR. mTOR is a target gene that will help in the rebuilding, remodeling, and growing, or we'll say growing or growth of the that broken down or used muscles. So we won't go into too much detail on mTOR, but mTOR is one of the pathways that we will then release this protein to help rebuild and remodel. And this happens a lot of times through that disruption or damage or mild micro tears to those working muscles in exercise that will signal these pathways to regulate protein synthesis within the muscle tissue. Again, one of the best ways I already said it is go through your full range of motion exercises. So during eccentric contractions of the lowering face, here you see Arnold in the bottom of his squat. This would be a full eccentric. Running downhill also increases a lot of damage to the muscle, which is a lot of eccentric contractions as well. During these contractions, passive muscle tension develops because of a lengthening of those extra muscle fiber elements, the collagen content, in the extracellular matrix, the tendons, the ligaments, the muscles themselves, all that stretching the I'm thinking of a term and it's my mind right now. I'll think about it in a second. The fascia gets stretched, gets torn, all and have micro tears. All these types, all this extracellular matrix and all the collagen that gets kind of stretched out, kind of like pulling on a piece of saran wrap and starting to stretch it and slightly disturb its shape. The body will then repair and remodel that. And again, a lot of that happens when we go into full stretches or full range of motion exercises. The next mechanism is muscle trauma. So as I've been mentioning, I'll go over this briefly, is that when we do exercise and we do go through eccentric contractions and sometimes also in concentric contractions, and through full range of motion exercise for that matter, we actually cause some damage to the muscle. There is some fraying essentially to these fibers, kind of like taking a intertwined rope and hanging a very heavy weight from it, and you start seeing some of the strands pop and break. Similar kind of concept with the fibers as we go through these full range of motion exercises with resistance, we see the fraying on the outside of that muscle. So when we have some local damage to that muscle, we cause a release of inflammatory molecules and immune system cells that activate these satellite cells. Very similar to if you have immune system sickness or you become ill, we send out ways of trying to clean that up and get rid of it. And we look at inflammation in the body as a sign of damage and a sign of, hey, we need to repair and fix this. So a lot of times this is when you become sore. You'll feel that delayed onset muscle soreness, like you might feel from doing a heavy resistance or eccentric exercise over and over. Usually over time this will go away as you become used to it. Let's just say it that way. You become more used to it. Your body's able to attenuate that soreness, and you don't always have to feel sore to have damage. So if you think that you have to be sore after every exercise, or every workout, that's not the case. So a lot of times, like I mentioned before, we'll have tears in that sarcolemma, the basal lamina, the connective tissues, and contractile elements. All those things can be damaged. Usually this happens at the weakest points of the sarcomeres. A lot of times it's when your arms are almost towards extension, almost going, like if we're lowering the weight. That's usually when we're potentially our weakest, and we'll see a lot more disruption there. We could also break down the T-tubules. That's where when we were saying an action potential down through, we'll talk about this a little bit later, neuromuscular, an action potential through the fiber. And it goes through the sarcoplasmic reticulum and into the T-tubules. It's going to release that calcium, which is important for muscle contraction. So Increased damage can affect the calcium levels within the muscle, and also some of the stretch activated channels, the opening and closing these channels, can get affected as well. So a lot of damage can be caused in muscle, but that's not a bad thing. We'll repair all that, and usually we'll increase everything. That's why we increase in essentially diameter and circumference, which means we might have more after we damage the T-tubules. We might have more T-tubules. We might come back with, if we remember from the training principles, with supercompensation. We might overcompensate and rebuild and remodel better so that we might be able to release more calcium in that next time we train, which might mean quicker contractions, more sustained contractions, stuff of that nature. So it's not always a bad thing. So here's another image in response to trauma. Here we have some kind of trauma right here within the working muscle. We will then turn on these satellite cells to, because of the inflammation, that might activate some satellite cells, and then these satellite cells might then have neutrophils come out and help, have macrophages, lymphocytes come out and clean up the extracellular debris, help maintain its structure, activate some myoblasts, macrophages, so on, to help repair and remodel all this. And here we see, if we're zooming into this beat up fiber, here we now have potentially satellite cells that have fused together, given up their nuclei, and now we have an increased diameter in this muscle, so we have essentially increased hypertrophy. So this is believed to lead to release all this damage is also believed to release a lot of growth factor hormones, and something like growth factor, progesterone, those types of things, to help with the muscle protein synthesis after damage. So a lot of things, this damage does release, essentially, will signal hormone release to help with the protein synthesis or the rebuilding phase. Last one is metabolic stress. And what could happen with metabolic stress is, if you ever felt that deep burn within your muscle, you're causing metabolic stress. So a lot of times, people were doing this for years and never really considered it like important for hypertrophy, but it really has a big place within increasing muscle hypertrophy. So metabolic stress causes cell swelling around the muscle, and we'll explain how this happens in a second, but which helps to contribute to muscle growth without actually increasing the myofilaments or the actin and myosin. So this is where we're talking about that, essentially that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, or that fluid volume within the muscle. And we could add more muscle glycogen to that working muscle. We might use all the glycogen within that working muscle, and then the next time we train, we might increase, or through repair processes, increase that muscle glycogen within the muscle. So again, these are the images. This is what we're talking about here with metabolic stress. We could have increases in size without the increased contractile proteins. So how this might occur, there's a couple of ways. A lot of times we cause an ischemic event, almost like putting let's say again we're doing curls with our arms, bicep curls. It's almost like putting a blood pressure cuff on your arm. As we are doing exercise, more and more exercise, let me make sure I can get this right in my head. Arteries, away, veins too. The arteries can get occluded, or they can get kind of start to close, or vasoconstrict, I guess would be a better word. So the fluid isn't able to escape, but we're still able to pump fluid there. So usually, if we don't have an occlusion, we're able to remove the fluid that's building up, and new fluid would come in. But as we train and as we go through resistance training, it's actually like putting a blood pressure cuff on it, and we're still able to get fluid there, but we're not able to get it out. So now we're able to increase that fluid within that working muscle, which is a good and a bad thing. It causes a very acidic environment if we can't get that byproduct out, and the body senses that as a dangerous environment within that muscle, and that could actually degrade the fiber because of how acidic it can be. So that will release a hormone response as well, for us to repair and remodel that. And a lot of the acidic environment comes from the increase in hydrogen ions due to anaerobic glycolysis. So if you remember going through glycolysis, you have glycogen into glucose, and then you go through glycolysis to then end up with pyruvate and hydrogen ions. Lactic acid you might hear of, and we use lactic acid for more energy. Lactic acid isn't the bad thing here. It's not what causes the burning. Lactic acid is positive thing, or yeah, in this term. But what's really happening is this byproduct of hydrogen ions is really the bigger issue here, and that increase in hydrogen ions will make that environment very acidic and will cause that burning sensation, and the body will sense that environment as an issue, and it will start to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system to release some hypertrophic hormones to help repair and remodel. So those are the three major ways. Here again is an image of cell swelling. We're still within the topic of metabolic stress. And so if we are to increase volume against this within the cell, or fluid within the cell, those cell walls, they're kind of like water balloons. As they expand or feel pressure, let's just use the term feel pressure, they view that as a threat to their cell walls. So they're going to respond by reinforcing their cell walls. And if you increase the thickness of a cell wall, if you're going to do that, you're going to increase its diameter. And then it's going to be able to withstand more fluid flow, or fluid, which is a positive, and it will also, the increased fluid flow and its increased in structure will increase its total diameter, increase in hypertrophy. So this is one of the mechanisms by which creatine is thought to work, where it increases fluid into the cell, and creatine is thought of that if you're working out and you take creatine, that it's going to increase fluid to that working muscle. And if you're increasing fluid, you increase cell swelling. And if you increase cell swelling, you're going to cause the body to enable anabolic hormones, or muscle protein synthesis to help repair and remodel. So those are the three major reasons or ways we can cause a disruption in homeostasis as we work out. We're going to talk about kind of how to do that in a second here. Let's talk about rest for a second. So I already mentioned this, and I'll just go over this briefly, but usually muscle protein metabolism to a resistance exercise lasts about 24 to 48 hours. So between protein metabolism and any meals consumed in this period, you'll usually impact muscle hypertrophy. So you have, a lot of people say you have this anabolic window, this short amount of time to get your rebuilding done, and that's not necessarily true. You could have a full day of, as long as you have proper nutrition, to repair and remodel. So don't worry about being in this horrible catabolic state, but you need to make sure you rest, get your proper nutrition, so the body does need its time to repair, 24 to 48 hours of repair. This is all very different on how old you are, your gender, and again genetics, on how much recovery you might need, and how fit you actually are, what your training age is as well. So let's go over some variables in terms of what you can do within a training protocol to affect stress, tension, and damage, because those are the three things you want for hypertrophy or muscle adaptation. So how can we affect those? First one, and probably the most important one, and arguably the most important one, is intensity. Usually when we talk about intensity, we talk about how many times you could lift a resistance one time, or your one repetition max. So that's a number given reps with a specific weight. Usually we talk about a percentage of that weight. So usually when we're talking about repetitions, we usually categorize them in three categories: low, moderate, or high. Low rep range is usually between 1 and 5 repetitions. Moderate is within 6 to 12, and high is 15 plus, give or take. And you see that those numbers don't really overlap, but they can easily. Moderate can be 6 to 15, and high can be, it depends on the individual, all the way up into the 20s. So each one of these rep ranges use different energy systems and tax the neuromuscular system in different ways. So we'll get into that with the neuromuscular system as well here in a second. So high reps in that 15-20 rep range, maybe even higher, aren't very good in terms of eliciting the hypertrophy as moderate or maybe even lower rep ranges are. Usually because you have to use a very light load. So if you're going to do 20 reps, it usually means you're going to have to lift a weight that's usually less than 65% of your one repetition max. And if you're lifting a load that low, it's really hard to see increase in hypertrophy. Again, if we go back to causing muscle tension, lifting a heavier resistance will increase muscle tension. So the heavier you go, the more muscle tension you could have. So that would mean that if you're lifting a really light load to do high reps, you wouldn't have much muscle tension. Now, in terms of damage, damage kind of falls in between there. You probably need to be somewhere in that moderate rep range and moderate resistance weight, which we'll talk about moderate resistance, excuse me, in a second here. We'll talk about that in a second, to be able to cause that muscle damage. Now, in terms of metabolic stress, yeah, if you were doing a lot of reps, you'd start feeling a burning because of going through anaerobic glycolysis, potentially starting to cause some kind of ischemic event in that working muscle. So out of the three categories, trauma, tension, and stress, you might, with high rep, low weight, be able to check off one of those boxes. But usually that's not enough for recruiting those big type 2 muscle fibers that we want to, really all the muscle fibers, to be honest, in terms of resistance training. So then we go, okay, high is not good. What about low and moderate? Both can produce gains in growth. So you could do low rep, high weight and see some changes. But the belief is that moderate rep range, approximately 6 to 12 to 6 to 15 reps, is the ideal place to be for increasing hypertrophy. So in terms of the superiority of moderate reps, mainly it's been associated with both metabolic stress. It does a really good job at covering everything. So we talked about how high reps really only get the metabolic stress. Well, low reps really only, low reps being only 1 rep or 2 reps or 3 reps usually, or up to 5. It doesn't really get you into the anaerobic glycolysis because it's so quick. You're only probably training for 15-20 seconds at max, with doing just a few reps at a time. So you're only going to be going through that, essentially that like ATPPC system. We don't really get that breakdown of glycogen for fuel, which then gives us that buildup of byproduct. So that moderate rep range, once you start getting into that 12, 15 rep range, one, you're usually, if you're failing around there, you have a pretty high resistance, a good resistance percentage to cause tension. We're also probably going to cause some muscle damage. And now, because we're going into anaerobic glycolysis, we're going to cause metabolic stress. So we're going to get all 3 things that we want in terms of muscle hypertrophy. So we're going to have a big buildup of metabolites. We're going to use our ATP, our creatine, our glycogen. We're going to increase our blood lactate. Our other anaerobic processes are going to be increased as well. And then a lot of metabolic buildup is going to occur. And that metabolic buildup is shown to maximize an anabolic hormone response, releasing in testosterone and growth hormone, elevated to a greater degree from those types of exercises than in the lower reps. And if you have increases in your anabolic hormones, you're going to have increases in remodeling of the muscle. Moderate rep ranges also maximize that cell hydration. So veins taking blood out of the working muscles are compromised or compressed, while arteries continue. I said that backwards earlier. So veins taking that blood out, arteries are delivering working fresh blood to the working muscle, thereby creating this concentration of intramuscular blood plasma, and this plasma seeps out of the capillaries into these spaces, interstitial spaces, and that buildup of fluid in these spaces causes a pressure gradient, which causes a flow of plasma back into the muscle, causing this pumping, or this, like someone blew up your muscles with a balloon, really pumped up feeling. And that is definitely going to cause some self-stress. When we talk about that moderate rep range, we talk about being time under tension. Time under tension means that the time you're actually lifting that weight. So if I'm lowering a weight, and I can count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. As I push it up, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6. So that whole time, that 6 seconds, I'm under tension. That's called time under tension. That rep took 6 seconds for me to lift. Time under tension with moderate rep is much greater than it is with something that's low rep. Because if you only lift something 1 time, that might be 6 seconds. But if I lift something 15 times, that takes 6 seconds each. That's what, 90 total seconds. So a minute and a half compared to 6 seconds, much big. That's just a greater difference in time under tension. And we know that we have greater chance of microtrauma and then using up all that energy and going through anaerobic glycolysis if we increase time under tension. Also, we have greatest applicability for slow twitch fibers, so great endurance capacity compared to our faster twitch fibers, which the whole muscle exhibits significant slow twitch profiles. So in terms of like people that are bodybuilders, you might see them cause increases in size of both their type 1s and their type 2s, where weightlifters and powerlifters, they only really tax their type 2 fibers, and those fibers are the faster, more explosive fibers. Where bodybuilders, because they're going for a much longer time during resistance training, you're going to see that they have a lot more type 1s. They're not as explosive as the other two categories. Weightlifters being like a power lifter, or excuse me, weightlifters being like an Olympic style lifter, and power lifters being someone that lifts a very heavy weight one time. Bodybuilders are going to be the biggest of the three usually, but they are definitely working a different type of fiber as they train. So let's look at the next category of things that we would be able to affect within training is our volume. And this is volume is the product of your reps, sets, and load in a training session. So if you do the math, if you do an exercise 3 times for 10 reps each time, and then you end up doing 6 total exercises, if you did the math, you would do each exercise is 30 reps, 3 times 10, so that's 30 reps, and then you do 6 exercises, so 30 times 6 is 180 total reps in that exercise routine. So that would be potentially one way of looking at the volume. We know that higher volume and multiple sets have been superior in terms of muscle growth and turning on these anabolic hormones than if you just went into the gym and just did 1 set. So what we like to see in terms of the training is if you can do 3 or 4 or 5 sets of 6 to 7 to 8 to 12 to 15 reps. So that'd be a much higher volume in a multi-set program than just going in and doing 1 set of 10 reps and you only did 10 total reps for that muscle group. That's just not enough. So a lot of times we'll break these exercises up in what's called split routines, where one day I'll do my legs, the next day I'll do my chest, the next day I'll do my arms, the next day I'll do my back, the next day I'll train my shoulders, and that would be called splitting the body up into different days. That allows you to do more reps on that one muscle group in that day when you're at the gym. So greater number of exercises per body part per workout. We're able to recruit more motor units. We're going to be able to increase the metabolic stress. We're going to cause more damage. We're able to really tax the body and cause it to go through protein synthesis or remodeling and rebuilding. If you go to the gym and do total body, it's not the end of the world, but if you did 1 exercise per muscle group, you're only going to probably do maybe 30 reps, 3 sets of 10 on that one, on your arms, let's say. And then you go to the next exercise and do legs, 3 sets of 10 on your legs, 30 reps. Then you do back, 3 sets of 10, 30 reps in your back. And so you're doing a different thing after different set of different body part in the same workout routine, compared to if you did a split routine and you spent the whole day doing arms and you did 8 arm exercises. You're going to do almost like 240 reps instead of 30. That's when you're really going to see changes, is when you really tax that muscle by increasing that volume. So in terms of duration, workouts greater than an hour can really affect your anabolic response. We talked about this 2 topics ago in terms of the testosterone cortisol changes. So, be really careful with how long you train. You really don't need to be beating your body up for more than an hour. But after you kind of let yourself recover, you don't need more than an hour or 2 before you can go back to the gym if you wanted to do multiple sessions in a day. But you don't need to be training for greater than an hour. Rest intervals plays an important role in muscle hypertrophy. If you're going to break it up into categories, short would be a 30-second or less rest interval. Moderate's usually around a minute to a minute and a half. And long rests are usually 3 to 5 minutes, maybe even longer in terms of long rest. If you took really short rests between sets of exercise, you're going to definitely increase your metabolic stress. You're not going to be able to have enough time to recover, and you're going to have that byproduct built up the whole time. You don't let it flush out at all, which isn't a bad thing, but you're never going to really be able to lift a substantial load or lift more weight or be very intense, because you're going to be always burning or always fatigued and never really recovered. On the other end of the spectrum, if you take a really long time, then you completely let your body recover and you completely flush out all that byproduct, which in terms of lifting something very heavy, probably not a bad thing, but you want to continually have some metabolic stress through your training protocol. So if you kind of can fall within that moderate rest range of 60 to 90 seconds between you do your exercises again, between sets, this really allows for that increase in metabolic buildup and that ischemic event that you really want to occur. It causes the body to understand how to buffer out that hydrogen ions and shuttle out that hydrogen out of that muscle, because you're continually building up and it shuttles out and build up, shuttle out, build up, shuttle out over and over and over and over. That's a really positive thing within the working muscle, and will allow you to do more reps or maybe a greater resistance with more reps later on as the body learns how to do that. You won't feel that burning sensation through training if you or training adaptations that might occur because you have allowed the body to learn how to buffer this increased amount of hydrogen ions. So we look at work-rest ratios, how much rest, and we're going to continue that topic of rest, is enough. Usually if you work, let's say, for 30 seconds, if you give yourself 150 seconds, that 1 to 5 work-rest ratio, that'll allow the ATP-PC to reset. Some people will say even longer than that. But usually 1 to 5 is good enough for energy. But if you're going to go for strength training or neuromuscular training, which we'll talk about later, you need a greater amount of rest. So you're going to need to definitely increase rest periods in terms of the neuromuscular system. But in terms of the muscular adaptations, usually a 1 to 5 work to rest ratio. Again, if 1 means that you work for 30 seconds, then the rest would be 30 seconds times 5 would be 150 seconds. If you're working for 1 minute straight, which is a lot, but 60 seconds, you'd give yourself 300 seconds of rest, which would be a lot. Be 5 minutes. That's probably more than you need, but 60 seconds straight of work is a lot in terms of hypertrophy, but that would be maybe on the high end. So other reasons why you might need more rest is that your training experience, you're new to the exercise, things are very demanding for you, and you have a ton of hydrogen ion buildup, and the environment is extremely acidic, and you need to take a break. That's understandable. If you're a bigger human being, both in obesity and muscle mass, you might need more rest as well. You're really using a lot of energy. You might need to take a little bit longer break. And if you have no aerobic fitness, you really struggle to catch your breath. Your cardiovascular system is quite poor. You'll struggle to recover in a short time frame, so you might need a little bit more rest. Is it necessary to train till failure? This is an interesting topic because some people think you have to lift a resistance until you can't lift it anymore, and that's not necessarily the case. This is hypothesized to activate a greater number of motor units. And we'll talk about motor units in a second with neuromuscular system. And so that means that if you lift a weight until you just can't lift it anymore, that means that you've taxed every single motor unit possible within that working muscle. When fatigued, a progressively greater number of motor units are recruited to continue activity. That's true. As you become more and more tired, you need to recruit more and more health. To continue training under conditions of anaerobic glycolysis heightens these metabolites, which in turn enhances the anabolic hormones. So if you are extremely fatigued and you're pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, you're continually using energy. You're continually causing metabolic stress, and you're activating motor units. So usually I don't know if I say it in the next one or not yet. It's not necessary to go completely all the way till failure. A lot of times you can potentially cause overtraining. You can cause a lot more damage than you can recover from. What we'd like to usually say is try to leave 1 to 2 reps left in the tank at the end of each set. So if you were to lift a resistance and you push as hard as you can, if you think you could do maybe 1 or 2 more and you could put that weight down, it's usually good enough. And there's times it is important that you go all the way to max. Sometimes the advanced lifters or someone in the later stage of a program should push themselves to full muscle fatigue and even beyond, which might be down at the bottom there where it says do as many reps as you can, then try to do 2 more. That could really release growth hormone potentially. Hypothetically, it might. But for the beginner, that's not necessary. You don't need to go with a failure. It will cause too much damage. It's way too intense. You could leave a couple reps in the tank and still see changes, and that would be okay. In terms of picking exercises for hypertrophy, the ones you really want to pick are the ones that are going to be multi-joint compound exercises. To perform or to promote uniform growth, you need to pick a bunch of different exercises because muscles like the traps or the trapezius you have in the image in the upper right, you have upper trapezius, middle trapezius, lower trapezius, and all those parts have different lines of pull, which means that different exercises like rows, upright rows, pull downs, all those types of exercises will target that muscle slightly differently. So in terms of muscle hypertrophy within a muscle, it's really important that as you become, I don't want to say more fit, but more accustomed to the exercise routine, that you start to look into other exercises to target the muscles correctly. And understanding your anatomy and your biomechanics is extremely important for this to know what type of exercises are best for that muscle. So again, with the exercise selection, multi-joint, which means like exercise like the squats, which are using your ankle joint, your knee joint, your hip joint. Those are multi-joint exercises, and those will recruit much more muscle mass than a single joint. A single joint exercise would be like just doing a bicep curl, which just works your elbow, or goes through the elbow joint, just works usually your biceps at that time. So there's research to show that you have a greater response in anabolic hormones and when you do more muscle mass within a given exercise. And usually when you're doing a multi-joint exercise, that's when you're going to have the most amount of muscle mass being used. There's over 200 muscles activated during a squat. A lot of those are just stabilization muscles through the back, the core, the legs, all that kind of stuff. But we do have large amounts of muscle used in the squat, and that's why things like squats, deadlifts, presses, pull-ups, stuff like that are used in many hypertrophy programs because you do get a greater anabolic response from it. In terms of machine, free weight, and dumbbell, it really doesn't matter. In terms of hypertrophy, you feel free to use all three. It never really hurts. A lot of people are so anti-machine. But in terms of hypertrophy, it's not a bad thing, especially for a beginner. I'd rather a beginner get in there and start doing some exercise, going through the full range of motion on a machine, get some confidence built up, some efficacy in terms of these exercises, and then they can transition from different exercises. In an ideal world, we would move more into a free weight barbell style exercise, or dumbbell for that matter. But sometimes people aren't capable of that right away, and that's okay. Any one of these will work. It's really about the tension, the stress, and the damage, and you can cause that in all three of these. Doing single joint exercises like your bicep curls, for that matter, your leg extensions, your leg curls, those aren't bad for specifically targeting muscles, and that's great. Like, that's needed as well. It can elicit a different neuromuscular activation pattern, which is good as well. It kind of signals that working muscle instead of spreading that pattern out across multiple muscles. So feel free to use single joint, and most people in hypertrophy programs will. In terms of unstable surfaces, I don't know any research really that has supported doing hypertrophy training on unstable surfaces, except for through the core, like your abdominals, your obliques, your transverse abs, stuff like that. You might see increases in potential hypertrophy in your core, but there's no research at least I don't know any, and it's usually quite frowned upon by most educated trainers that you don't do hypertrophy training on unstable surfaces. Usually you would do that, an unstable surface training for a rehab-based exercise, but usually not much else. You lose a lot of force production when you're on unstable surface. So in terms of reps, how many reps we should do, so we talked about rest. You should be in that moderate rest range, 60 to 90 seconds max, give or take, and not max. You can go maybe 2 minutes, but that's the rest range. We talked about volume, higher volume, essentially the better. And we talked about sets. You wanted to be within that 3 to 6 set range, which kind of lands us within volume, how many reps should we do within those sets? Now, there isn't an exact number. I can't give you like this has to be the exact number, but it should change with what you're doing, your goals, your conditioning. But you could follow this image on the bottom here. And if we look for yellow being the most important thing, we see hypertrophy, and you see there's no dead set lines. These blend because there is, you could see hypertrophy goes all the way up into the 16s, and you actually can get hypertrophy up here and down here. Here's where it's kind of its hot spot. We would like to be somewhere within 6 to 12 reps, and that will allow us those things that we've talked about before, causing the stress. It lets us lift a heavy enough resistance to cause tension, and then of course we'll be doing enough reps with a heavy enough tension to cause some trauma. So we would like to fall somewhere within this 6 to 12 rep range. Here's another image, same kind of concept. Here's your reps. Again, these are max reps where you might fail at. Here, with that 9 to 12 rep range might be best for hypertrophy. Still can see some gains higher. Here we start working on muscular endurance. And here at the top, we're kind of working on the neuromuscular system. Yeah, we'll cause a lot of tension, but we won't cause a lot of trauma or stress. Here we'll cause a lot of stress. We won't cause a lot of trauma or tension. In this vicinity here, we'll kind of get the best of everything, where we'll have a heavy enough resistance to cause tension. We'll cause, because of the multiple reps with that heavy tension, we'll cause some trauma. And then because we're doing a lot of reps, we'll end up causing metabolic stress. Okay, a couple more slides on this video. Apologize if I'm talking a little fast. I don't want to upload a massive video if I don't have to. So let the reps dictate the weight. Pick a weight. A lot of times, people, you don't even need to know the number on the dumbbell that you pick up or the barbell. Lift it up and see where you fail at, or come close to failure. If you're falling within that 6 to 12 rep range or 6 to 15 rep range, you've got the right weight. It doesn't really matter. Again, the ego part of resistance training. It's more or less the body only reacts to you doing a certain number of reps with a specific load. Again, you want to essentially fatigue or fail in this range. You just don't want to stop. Like when you say 6 to 15 reps, it means that you either have two reps left in the tank, or you literally can't do any more reps somewhere within this range. Don't just pick up a really light weight and say, oh, he told me to do 6, I'll do 6 and put it down. No. You have to fatigue here. The body's gonna then sense the tension and the trauma and the stress potentially caused by that. So make sure you pick a weight that lets you fall within that rep range. These words are backwards. If you go less than 5, it's probably too heavy, and you go greater than 15, it's probably too light. I gotta change that, but you probably can understand that. If you are using a predetermined percent rep max, so something that someone told you to use, or something you didn't test, you just calculated it out, or some computer program that tells you it, just be careful, because you might not be prepared for that resistance, or that resistance might be too light. So always adjust things so that you are fatiguing where you need to fatigue in terms of getting the gains that you want to make. In terms of fiber composition, muscle with high percent of slow twitch fibers responds to high reps, usually slightly on the lower end range of the weight. So somewhere within that 65-70%, so on down the line. You might need to do more reps for something that's a type 1 fiber. Type 2 fibers, usually a heavier weight, more explosive. Again, on that continuum would probably be okay for the type 2 fiber. So if you can know what the percentage of those muscle groups are, or muscles that you're working are, then you could kind of really specify the workout that you want to do to work that muscle group. Also, understand that certain exercises like Olympic lifts or deadlifts or squats, again, if you don't know what these are, you might want to look these up, might be really tough to do a lot of reps with. So when you're scripting these things or you're going through them, yeah, I said maybe do 15 reps, but if the load is very high, that might be too difficult and too demanding. And something that's an explosive exercise like an Olympic lift, you don't necessarily want to do high reps with. It's too technical and you could potentially hurt yourself. So you wouldn't do that. This GIF of this girl deadlifting in heels is just stupid, and that's why I put it in there, because I think it's funny. So some variables to influence how many sets you might do of an exercise might determine by how many reps you do. If you're doing a lot of reps per set, you might do a lot of sets. If you do fewer reps, you might do a lot of sets. If you're doing a ton of exercises in a training session, you probably aren't going to do a lot of sets, mainly because you'll be there forever. If you are new to training, do fewer sets. It's okay. You could go in and just start learning things, and that's fine. You don't need to go in and do a bunch. Most of the time when people are learning, I tell them to do a total body routine and just do one set of everything and just learn and get the body used to things. If you're not hydrated and if you're not fueled up, you might fatigue fairly quickly. If you don't have the energy, you're not going to be able to do a lot of sets. And then muscle size, again, smaller muscles like biceps, calves, triceps can recover pretty quick. But if you're doing a lot of sets on big muscle groups, you're going to fatigue. You use a lot of energy. That's just because you're going to use a lot of energy to work those muscles. So you're not going to be able to do as many. Also, make sure that you individualize how many sets someone might do. Make sure that no matter how many you rate, that you're always looking for the quality of the exercise and the technique over quantity. So it doesn't mean you have to keep doing them if they suck. If they're good, go ahead. If you're not doing them very good, stop. Keep an eye on how long you're there for. So if you got to limit how many sets you do, because you might only be in the gym for an hour, hour and a half max. So you can't write a ton of sets in and do a lot of sets if you can't fit them all into your workout time. And then depending on the composition, some things work, like slow twitch fibers can use a lot more sets, or a lot more reps, and fewer sets, where fast twitch could be a lot heavier and less reps, but fewer or more sets. So you might do a fast twitch muscle group like the gastrocnemius of the calf, and you might do much heavier load, but you only do 8 reps. But then because you're only doing 8 reps or 6 reps, you could do more sets because you're not doing that many reps. In terms of, let's say you're doing the soleus and you're doing a seated calf raise, you might do 20 reps, but because you're doing 20 reps, you might do fewer sets, like 2 or 3. So here would be just a simple breakdown of how you would summarize all the things we just talked about. In terms of reps, you should be around 6 to 15, sets around 3 to 4, intensity should be 60 to 85% of your 1 rep max. Your rest should be 60, 90 to 120 seconds. So your medium to high volume training should be around an hour. And then depending on how often you work out, it's okay if you go 1 to 2 times per week on an individual body part, and 3 to 5 times a week total is usually good enough. And then total duration, that could fluctuate. So that's going to end this video. And then the next video that will be posted will be on the neuromuscular system and the science of strength, and we'll have that posted up today as well. So thank you very much.